now of the Fiscal Cliff's impact with Stan Collender, Qorvis National Director of Financial Communications, and Cao Tan, CEO of Shengya Capital, joining me live from Beijing. Stan, let me start with you. What Jessica is talking about right now, and this is a fairly significant change in tone in just the last 30 or 40 minutes or so, is that what do you make of the fact that the Republicans weren't able to gather enough votes, so to speak, to at least get an amendment on the floor? Was it that, or was it the time issue?
Well, it might have been something else entirely, and that is that if they passed this amended bill and sent it back to the Senate's already hinted that they're not going to take it up, would probably wait till the new Congress starts on Thursday, when Democrats have bigger numbers. So what would come back to the House, and in fact would probably be a worse deal, not a better deal. And I think the leadership has tried to impress that upon him, that there's nothing more than a symbolic gain in putting an amended bill back and sending it over to the Senate.
I want to get into more details of the bill, but I want to get Cao Tan's comments from Beijing on this. You know, as you and many other professionals are watching this from around the world, especially there in Beijing, what is the mood and sentiment in terms of how this bill might affect the overall global economy?
Well, I think this whole fiscal cliff charade clearly shows that the favorite hobby of the U.S. politicians is to kick the can down the road. You know, they always go out of their way to kick the can. You know, a lot of people here in Beijing, they're very worried about having to foot the bill for the $1 trillion budget deficit in the U.S. because if the U.S. politicians do not have the courage and confidence to really cut the deficit, who would foot the bill? It's going to be the creditors in Beijing and Tokyo. They have to continue to buy U.S. treasuries, or the Federal Reserve has to finance the budget deficit. And that would dilute the value of their treasury holdings. That would debase the dollar. It's going to be quantitative easing 4, 3, 5, right? So it's going to be endless money printing and inflation.
All right,
so,
let me get Stan to comment on that. I mean, look, what Cao Tan is saying is that basically from an international perspective, they look at sort of the dysfunctionality of U.S. politics. We do have creditors around the world, China being one of them. And there's this sense that, I don't want to say the system is broken, but certainly us going over the cliff, and even if we were to come back again, that doesn't bode well in terms of confidence being instilled from investors or creditors or from a global perspective, right?
Well, no, look, that's certainly true in a theoretical sense, except if you look at the continued demand for U.S. treasuries, there's been no diminution of demand from overseas for them. In addition, add the Federal Reserve in, and interest rates are actually pretty low in the United States because there is a continuous supply of cash.
Well, the interest rate is low in the U.S. because the Federal Reserve intervened in the bond market and keep the quantitative easing going. And all the central banks, they supported the federal budget deficit in the U.S. If the bond vigilantes woke up to the fact that the U.S. politicians can't hold their feet to the fire, they talk the good talk but can't walk the walk. They always talk, but they never back their rhetoric with substantive action.
All right, I'm going to step in here because I don't want to get into a debate about economics necessarily, because we want to focus this on the fiscal cliff. Now, some parts of this deal that's being voted on by the Senate here, and now the House is considering, part of that is the permanent extension of tax rates, capital gains tax. I mean, these are all things that I think all of us can agree on, that it's a good thing to not ever have to hopefully worry about this ever again. Isn't that a good thing, perhaps, that we don't have to worry about another negotiation, at least on tax rates?
But Philip, you're only looking at the nominal tax. What I'm worried about is the inflation tax, because that is much worse than the nominal tax. Because if they can't reduce the government spending, what they do is they have to continue the deficit spending. The deficit spending have to be financed one way or the other. They can either borrow the money from China or Japan, or the Federal Reserve had to print the money for the government to spend. If they print the money, that's just as that's much worse than tax increase.
Basically, what you're saying is that it doesn't. You're basically saying it doesn't address the spending issue, and that's a really good point. And Stan, look, he's not alone. There's a lot of people here in Washington that say, hey, spending was not addressed. We are kicking it down 60 days, aren't we?
Well, first of all, one of the things the private sector, internationally as well as domestically in the U.S., has been demanding is some certainty on rates and on policy. They're getting that with some of the permanent changes you're talking about. That's number one. Number two, The last thing you want to do is start cutting the deficit at this particular moment. That's the whole point of the fiscal cliff. That's what Ben Bernanke was talking about when he invented the phrase. That is, when the private sector is not spending, when consumers aren't spending, when state and local governments are cutting back.
I completely disagree with Stan's assessment that government spending would stimulate economic growth.
This is not me. This is Ben Bernanke. This is Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Ben Bernanke is wrong on that.
Well, I'm sorry. I've got to believe
all the wealth comes from other taxes or borrowing.
I've got to believe the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve knows more about the U.S. economy than you do.
Is to cut the government spending. The U.S. have to follow the austerity measures in Greece, in Spain. The only reason they can get away with it right now is because the U.S. dollar continues to serve as the reserve currency of the world. But if the U.S. abuses that privilege and continues to deficit spend,
gentlemen, I've got the 30-second bell ringing in my ear. Last word from each of you. Cao Zhan, does this deal move things forward? I know you're not happy with the whole deal, but is this better than no deal at all?
I think the best deal for them is to, stick to their original plan, which is to cut the deficit spending, cut the deficit by about $600 billion in 2013, because that would show that they're serious about cut deficit spending.
Okay. And it would have thrown the U.S. into...
Stan, last word. Is this deal good enough, or is there something else you'd like to see in it that's
There's much more I would have liked to have seen or seen done differently, but the one thing I didn't want to have happen is $600 billion in deficit reductions when the U.S. economy cannot handle it. It would have thrown us into a recession, which would have made the entire world worse.
On that. Okay. The best thing that can happen to the U.S. economy is to cut spending and allow the private sector to flourish.
Stan, Cao Zhan, thank you very much for your time. Of course, a good thing we don't have to vote on any of this stuff, and there's other people doing that, but thank you for your time.